to the 12th Annual Humanities Montana Festival of the Book. Thanks to everyone for being here. This is going to be a great session. This has been a real weekend of discoveries. And one of the greatest, I think, has been the Missoula Writing Collaborative. I was telling Jason, I'm from Billings. We have to get you guys on the eastern part of the state.
Yes.
Yeah. And we're going to find the funding to do it somehow. Because what you're doing is amazing. It's just amazing to me. And to a lot of us. The work that you guys are doing, the work you're doing in the classrooms is changing lives.
Yes.
And you are the heart of the humanities. So thank you for that. Applause! With that, I'm just going to introduce Jason Neal, who is the moderator. And so Jason, welcome and the team.
Thanks Julie. So for those of you who maybe don't know or aren't perfectly sure, the Missoula Writing Collaborative is a nonprofit Writers in the Schools program that serves the Missoula region and a few points beyond. And we place professional writers in schools to help young people discover the power of words and the value of expression through the process of creative writing. And I am sitting up here with Mark Gibbons, Alex Alviar, Laura Lee Evans-Lynn, Carol Addis, and Sheryl Noethe. And I'm going to ask them in a few minutes to give more full and appropriate introductions for each of them. But I don't want to sit here and sort of hear my own voice for too long. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a few minutes. So this panel is called, I think we won an award for the longest panel name. And the best title?
Yeah.
I knew the longest, I wasn't sure. So this panel is titled, When I Was a Rabbit, Classroom Corrections, When, How, and Why, or Why Not. I mean, it's got a parenthesis in it. And the title is taken from a poem written by a young person that I have distributed copies of. But our esteemed poet laureate is going to read it out loud for us, if you will.
Okay. This was written by a child in Houston. The Houston Writers in the Schools program used this as the first part of an interview to hire writers to go into the schools with children. I'll read it to you and then I'll tell you, or you'll probably guess, but I'll tell you how important it is. When I was a rabbit, I was on a picnic with my mom and dad. Then I turned into a rabbit. "Hlap, hlap me," I said, but they could not hear because I turned into a rabbit. I was afraid and I called, "Hlap, I am a rabbit," but they still could not hear me. And I was hungry and they still could not hear me. I cried and cried. I said, "Hlap me, but they could not hear me. When we give this to someone who's interested in working in the classroom, we say, "What would you say to this child?" And the people who say, "Well, first of all, I teach them how to spell help." We go, "Okay, thanks, bye, that's enough."
Thank you, Sheryl. No, finish your thought.
But people who say, "I hear you. It must have been terrible. Tell me about it. Let's write it down."
So we're here to have what we hope is a lively conversation, and one that includes not just the five people on this panel, but also the members of the audience, about teaching creative writing, and specifically about response to student work. The title mentions correction, which is one kind of response, but I think really we want to open up the discussion to include not only correction, but revision and suggestion and praise and flattery, and all kinds of responses. And even I think no response to student work is a kind of response that we might examine. There are challenges inherent in responding to students' creative work. What kinds of responses encourage? What kinds of responses discourage? what kinds of responses are truly instructive, and what kinds really aren't, even though they may appear to be on the surface. How clear are we as educators, and I'm not really one, but they are, but how clear are we as educators about the intent and effect of our responses to student creativity? And I think those questions become even more compelling and more complicated, certainly, when we remember that creative writing is usually not the only kind of writing that students are learning. Our motto at the Collaborative is, we teach kids to love to write. Period. It's not we teach kids to love to write poems, or we teach kids to love to write made-up stories. It's we teach kids to love to write. So I think it's important to recognize that at pretty much all age levels, even if kids are fortunate enough to be learning creative writing, they're probably also spending even more time learning expository forms. And expository forms of writing have different purposes, different goals, and I think therefore warrant different types of responses. So, how do we respond to creative writing in ways that are legitimately instructive and helpful, but also reinforce and certainly don't confuse the kinds of instruction or response that kids are getting to other kinds of writing? Again, I think this is going to be a pretty free-form conversation. I don't have a whole lot of lists of questions or anything like that, so I'm counting on you to all help me keep it moving. And I'm also going to keep an eye on the audience. I don't, if you have questions or comments, don't feel compelled to wait till the end. Raise your hand. I'd love to get people involved in the conversation as we're having it. And we'd be especially interested to hear from some of the young people in the audience who are tasked with receiving, processing, and learning from these responses that teachers give their creative work. I think that is really interesting. So, I think the way I'd like to get this started is if we could just go down the line and each of you could say a little bit about yourselves. If you're a writer, maybe talk a little bit about your writing, but also your work as a teacher. And also what I'd like to hear from each of you is just sort of, and this is a pretty general question, but what kinds of principles do you have in mind when you take up the work of responding to student work, or what comes to mind in terms of the principles that you want to manifest when you're responding to student work? Would you like to start, Mark?
How did I get sit on the head of the class?
Because I pushed you that
Big
way.
trouble.
It's your fault. My name is Mark Gibbons, and I was happy enough to answer that question for Sheryl about 15 years ago. Her and Robin Childress were interviewing MFA students for a job as a teaching in the schools, and see, I'm not prepared. What I would like to do in response to it all is to just kind of, because he kind of tipped me off in an email the other day about this whole business of evaluation, and because as far as I'm concerned, there's no room for evaluation, period, when it comes to creative writing by young people. And I wrote down in an email to you. Can I just read that?
Yeah.
It's not that long.
No, go ahead.
So I'm just going to read this. I think
It's
it's
a bit of a
probably
cop-out,
clearer
but
than
go
me
ahead.
just kind of, wandering around, going back and forth and saying nothing. Yeah, it's a cop-out. I wrote this to him in an email in response to just those kinds of questions that he just asked.
Are you going to read all the words, or are you editing
No,
as
I
you
am
go?
editing. Yeah, I won't read some of the words. But because, I never know how to respond to those kinds of things. And particularly that language is, I hated it as a teacher, and I still don't like it. So anyway, I said I loved language when I was a kid. I loved stories and sound play, jokes and rhymes and songs and voices, but I didn't become interested in language on the page until I was in high school, and I really didn't learn the rules until I was in college. I think most kids are like that. One of the reasons I didn't like reading or grammar was that I had no patience for it. My mind went faster than my eye. I was in the slow reading group, you know, the dummies. And none of the stories that I was exposed to in school before I was 15 interested me in the slightest. It's more important to let kids express themselves on paper and learn to love writing when they're young. They'll love the rules on their own. I did. And I ain't no rocket scientist. I'm just a guy who loves to write and discovered that it was very important to be able to write in a way that would be easy for others to read. Most often that means the rules of standard written English. But a poem? A poem. It's a license to chart your dreams. That's not to say that I don't take liberties with student poems, the ones I type. I sometimes punctuate or capitalize or spell differently than what I see, and very often I play with line breaks. But the student always has to approve those suggestions I make, and often they will ask me to change my changes. And I always follow their directions because they own the poem. Oftentimes I can't read the spelling, and I guess at what they want. Or I make changes I think they would agree to, but sometimes they don't like my changes or my guesses. So I go back and do as they tell me. It's their poem. That's the most important thing, that they understand I am not correcting their poem, but merely suggesting what seems right to me. And if they say my changes are not right, then my changes are not right. Simple. What's most valuable here is trust. And when I say they are free to write any way they want, I must follow through on that promise. Kids recognize lies a mile away. Enough. Do you understand what I mean? Respect is the most important thing. It really is.
Yeah, and we traded, so we had some follow-up emails about that. I think that that's actually an important concept to kind of, maybe others can comment on that as well, because I think even if you don't necessarily agree with Mark in terms of having such a light touch in your response, I suspect we all agree that respect is pretty important, and that can be shown in a number of different ways. So, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. Alex.
I'm Alex Alviar. I have taught poetry at, I started in Ronan, and then was in Arlee, and then Mission Elementary, and did a little stint at Russell, and also at the Talbot Youth Homes as well.
St. Ignatius, too.
Yeah, Mission St. Ignatius. Depends on what you want to call it then. I started with the collaborative in the fall of 2003, I believe. I was lucky enough while I was an MFA student here to be the opening act for Sheryl, and so had a good crowd and everything, had a good time.
Where?
And a few months later, or actually almost a year later, I called her because I was working on a project to actually do poetry in the Deer Lodge State Prison. And so I called Sheryl, just kind of curious, like, what is this Missoula Writing Collaborative thing? What do you do? How do you make this work? And then she decided to hire me, and so much for that project. But it's been a really kind of wonderful teaching and learning experience for myself. When it comes to responding to especially a young person's creative writing, first, I want to back up and say I never had creative writing in high school or middle school. There was no classes like that. And so I had no sense of what that was like to sit in a class workshop and give feedback and all that sort of thing. Even as an undergrad in college, my own instructors would take our poems. We'd all nervously get up there and read. I shouldn't say instructors, my one instructor. Put them in a pile. We'd all go out and smoke cigarettes while she was back in the room arranging them from worst to best.
Nice.
Yeah, that was the model of learning that I had.
That's a response.
Yeah. And sadly, you know, a lot of us got weeded out who I thought were really talented, and maybe the talent wasn't that developed yet, but their heart was right, and it got totally destroyed. And of course, the only ones left to rise to the pile, I was lucky enough to, you know, I just really loved it that much. Like, I got to this point, I don't care what she says, I don't care where I land in the pile, I'm just gonna do more of this. And, you know, lo and behold, one day she put me to the top of the pile. And that's not a good thing. That's actually a sad thing. Okay, I'm not saying, like, that's actually I think of a lot of the other people who, they could be really enjoying this to this point in their life now, and they're never going to. In fact, if anything, they're completely turned off from it. And so I always keep that in mind. It's like, okay, that's where I came from. That's how I was trained in poetry. That's not good. The collaborative, what we do, is completely opposite of that. So the context, I guess what I would say, just very quickly, the way I tend to respond to kids and their poems, and actually any student of mine, is really focusing first, before I say anything, I look at, what is my relationship with this student? Where are we? Do we know each other well enough? There's enough trust between the two of us that, you know, if there is something where I can say, hey, this is great, let's put this bottom part down here. I really like what you did up top. Let's do more of that down here. Got it? If we're in a really, really solid relationship, I go for that. If we're still starting off, though, and I don't really, this is kind of a cold call, I don't really know the student just yet, I mean, I'm just going to go with praise. Find what I can praise and go with that for now, and let the relationship develop. As that relationship grows and develops, then we can start looking at those other sorts of quote-unquote corrections or redirections. But my main goal is to be, you know, a relationship builder in the classroom, and that's through the work, through the feedback, through what we do in class. And so that's kind of my main approach. One of the other things I do as a specialty of mine is I'm really trying to launch this research project of what does poetry in the brain do? What happens, what does neuroscience have to say about when a kid does poetry and creative writing, what does it do to their brain? And so far I've kind of found this model that it actually works really well with, and it's based off of Eric Jensen, those of you might know him who are teachers, and the whole brain-based learning thing. But the first principle was you cannot teach unless you have certain things set in place. A child will not learn unless you have this environment already built in place. Neurologically, they cannot learn. And so 5 things just off the top. Place has to feel safe, no threats. Child must be willing, because it feels safe, willing to take risks. Third thing, kids gotta care. Has to be vested, emotionally vested in whatever the work is. Fourth thing, connection. So social connection, feeling connected to their peers in the class, to their instructors, to the poet in the classroom as well. So having that sense of a learning community that they're connected to. Fifth thing and last thing is the sense of hope. Now you can imagine with the type of feedback that you do and you handle, you can dash all 5 of those very easily. So what we do, at least as a poet, first one, safe, no threats. We tell the kids right away, you cannot fail at this. It's your poem. There's no way to get this wrong. Okay. And by the way, I'm going to set up this whole thing, this wonderful poetry exercise, but guess what? If you have a different poem in your heart today, go for it, kid. It's all you. Right. So safe, no threats. That means we set them up then, second part. Yeah, take risks. We're not going to worry about grammar. We're not going to worry about spelling. We're not going to worry about these things. Take some risks. And believe it or not, the more they experiment with combinations of language, I find this even as a college professor teaching Comp 1, Comp 2, research paper writing, the more a student is willing to experiment with, and if we're just going to talk about sentence structure and grammar, right? the more they don't think about that, but are willing to experiment with different combinations of language, varying their sentence structure, going compound, complex, all these things, they don't have those names for them, but the more they're willing to experiment with those combinations, the better they get. And so with the poetry, it's the same thing. Take risks, try different combinations of language as much as you can. That's why we give them these things where they can write crazy all over the page. It seems like silly child's play, but we're actually opening up and giving them hands-on experience to try different combinations of language. Right? Emotionally vested, obviously, we try to really get them, like, link your personal life with the writing. Okay? Care. And the more they care, the more they'll do it. The more they do it, the more they'll try. The more they'll take risks, the more they'll, right, not feel threatened, the more confident they feel, all those sorts of things. Connection. We read to each other. We share our poems. Sometimes they pair up. They have readings at the end. Everyone claps for each other. And then with me, they give me their poems. Based on that relationship, again, based on that connection, that's the baseline for the kind of feedback I give them. And then, last one's hope. They pour their dreams, usually, into the poems. They try things. Weird, crazy ideas of theirs. They'll be willing a little bit more to pursue kind of offbeat thinking. And that's what we want. A little sense of hope of, like, and usually, I like to think that's what educators believe. Like, education itself is like, if you want something better, you can change it through learning. So, that's a big one. And so in that, that's the larger context where anything I say, anything I do, like those are the principles I'm always kind of using to manage, what I write, what comes out of my mouth, how I monitor the way the students are treating each other and respecting each other, so making sure no kid's laughing at someone else and making fun of their poem, unless, of course, that's exactly what the kid wants, but, right? So, pass. Your turn.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. You know, before I forget, I just want to say I think this notion of relationship is absolutely baseline for all of this. And I'm guessing that all of us feel that way, that relationship is absolutely critical to anything you do. I mean, before a child comes on board with you, they've got to trust you.
Yeah.
And I'm worried I'm going to forget that somehow in the big wash of things. So I'm Laura Lee Evans Lynn, and I have been teaching at Big Sky High School for 27 years. And I am the recipient of the collaborative. I have had collaborative teachers in my classroom for, I don't know, it's been a long time, 15 years, maybe more. It's been a long time. And that has enriched my classroom and my students' lives so much. And I have a couple of students out here, actually. And I hope they'll talk at some point and tell you what they think. But I think my situation is different in that I came to Missoula to get to the MFA program. So that's what I did first. I didn't know that I wanted to teach. I came here, got my MFA, and they put me in a classroom, and I was in that classroom and realized, wow, I really like this. And that's when I figured out I wanted to teach. So I kind of did everything backwards. I had my MFA, and then went and got my teaching certificate, and then went to teach, and didn't get to teach creative writing for 10 years or so. But I am very lucky now to have a creative writing class and 2 literary magazine classes that include advanced creative writing. So we are, awash in creative writing all the time. And what I brought with me into the classroom, even from the time I had a very good friend who was a little like you, Sheryl, actually. Very interesting friend who at 13, she was a poet. And I went to her to have her help me write. And from that point on, I was writing. And so I always wanted feedback from my friends. I got to live in this wonderful environment in high school, in college, in the program here even, where we wanted feedback from people. And that feedback was positive, and loving, but it was also something to help us. And so it never occurred to me, I don't think, that my students wouldn't want that they wouldn't want that kind of feedback, that they'd want something real from me after we had established relationship. And, you know, I think I come at it from a variety of angles because it is both the poetry for me, you know, the reality, the beauty of the ideas and the hopes and the dreams, but I'm also a writing teacher. And I do need to teach some things. But what I had tried to begin to do a few years ago was use poetry to help teach some things like sentences and word choice and sentence fluency and those kinds of things. I would like to believe, and maybe you'll hear from them, but I would like to believe that I use those as ways to help make the writing better. But I don't think it's anything different than what you were talking about, where this is something where you might want to try it and see what you think. And if they don't want to do it, they don't have to do it. They might get, I might come back to it and say, you know, I really think you might want to consider this. But ultimately, the work is theirs. Ultimately, it's not my work. And I don't make those changes. They do. I might write all over their poem. And a lot of people in here have seen my writing all over their poems. But they do it too. They write all over each other's. But then they go home or to the computer or wherever that is, and they decide what of that stuff they're going to use and what they're going to take. So I do use poetry to some extent to help teach some writing conventions, but not at the expense of poetry, I hope. And I want to say this before I forget, but I was listening to NPR this morning, and Scott Simon was on talking about Steve Jobs, who just died. And I, of course, only caught the last 3.5 seconds of it. But he was talking about how radically successful Steve Jobs was, what a genius he was, and that despite that, he always kept his impish determination in no matter what he designed. And what Scott Simon said was that he was the guy who colored outside of the lines. And it seems to me that's what I want to help students with, is that I want them to know what good writing is, and I want to encourage them and push them to color outside the lines, and that hopefully I will have the good sense to recognize the beauty and the genius of that as it comes.
How, and maybe this is more of a question for the students, but when you're commenting on their work and you're saying you're writing all over it, I mean, how specific will you get sometimes? Will you suggest a word in lieu of another one?
You know, I'm really glad you asked this, because this is something that I started only in the last few years. And you could say, there are some people who could say that I'm intrusive. I mean, you could say that I go that far. But I realized a few years ago that if you don't give someone, if you don't model how a sentence might work, they don't know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. You can't say to students, or at least my experience has been, that if I say, and kids will say this to each other all the time, because we edit no matter what I'm teaching. We edit English, essays, poetry. I mean, it's all writing. And they'll say, you know, that doesn't flow very well. But they don't know what to do with that. So I will sometimes, I began a couple of years ago, like I will say, well, maybe you could start this way, and then I go ... So I'm just, maybe these are some places you could go. And then we'll sit down and talk about other words and other possibilities. And I will often put down a word with a big fat question mark and another word with a big fat question mark. And I'm not trying to give them my words to use in their poem. I'm trying to model other directions they could go should they choose to. That's my intention.
I think that's really interesting, and I think that whole matter of modeling is actually pretty key, especially as the writing is becoming kind of more sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking
Sure.
junior, seniors.
I was at a panel earlier today over at the library about publishing, and one of the panel presenters, it was kind of this debate about the merits of traditional publishing or the new self-publishing and electronic publishing and all those things. And one of the panelists said that, one of the benefits, even though there's all this empowerment through self-publishing, one of the great benefits of traditional publishing is that you get an editor, and if you get a good one, and he said his editor made him a better writer immeasurably. And I think, this comes back to the relationship and the trust and all of that. I think, whether comments are invasive, is that the word that you
Well,
use?
I worry
I think
that it could be perceived
But
that
that's,
way.
I think, probably less about the nature of the specific comment than it is about the relationship with the student, right? How it's perceived, whether it's perceived as invasive or not, is a matter of trust in a way. Anyway.
Can I say two more things? I'm sorry. I have something you guys don't have. I'm with them every day, all the time. And so we can build relationship much more quickly. It's there. And I have a creative writing class right now. I'm just meeting those kids. And on the first poem, we clapped for each other. That was wonderful. That was beautiful. That was a great image. Second poem, we all clapped for each other. That was gorgeous. Third poem, it was in a group, and we read, and they kind of edited each other's, gave each other some ideas, but then we sat down and I said, well, what about this as a possibility? So it was really just light at the beginning until we've established that relationship. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I'm Carol Addis. I teach fourth grade at Lowell Elementary. I think we've had the poet in the building for 15 years?
Yes.
I think, yeah, it's been. And I know that our own daughters had Sheryl for a poet at Prescott. And so I've been a mom and a teacher, and my background is completely elementary ed. So when the poet first started coming, I have to admit that I was the one who sat at my desk and corrected papers and let the poet do their thing. Yeah. And that's embarrassing to admit, but now I write with the kids, and I find, for starters, they trust me more. They trust what they can say more because I'm doing it too. And I started out with a kid and said he wasn't going to write and he wasn't going to read, and I said, well, how about I write and I'll read if I will you? Yes. And so that started, the kids are all wound up about what I write. And so I've learned a whole lot about being a poet. But the thing for us is all about trust. And so we're at the beginning of level where you guys are. Everything we do, we never edit anything. Our poets in the past have taken the poems and they've typed them up, and occasionally we've had kids say, that doesn't look like what I had. Change it. But, or they get offended. But our whole purpose is to build that trust, build that creativity, play with the language, try it out, and fourth graders are nothing short of completely coloring out the lines, most of them, and so they will try you out the first time around and say, can I get away with saying, the monster ate my dog and my homework, and when we all laugh, they go, oh, I can say that stuff. It's okay, and then we get down to the really deep stuff like, my dad died, and that's where they go with that. And I don't know about high school kids. If little guys will go with that, and they'll tell us, and we'll all go, wow, but it's just a part of their life. So we don't edit spelling, anything, and when they start to write, I always say, I don't want your hand up. I want you, unless you're going to ask us for it, I'm trying to work on this idea, but I don't want to hear about spelling. I want you to do the best that you can do and move on, because we're interested in the ideas, and we'll help you with the spelling. If you really get done, you really got to have me help you out, then we will. But we focus on how you're going to say it, what are you going to say, tell me more. That was a cool part. Tell me more. And what about this? And what color was that dog? And what to do then? And that kind of stuff. They're pretty sensitive to feedback. We do a lot of everybody reads, everybody claps. Occasionally we do, can you What was something cool you heard? What was a good word? And they love that. But a few years ago, this has been many years ago, Sheryl, we had a poet that every kid who got up to read, she would just scream, "That was wonderful!" And the kids would all look at her. And after a while, the quality of the poetry went down and down and down because everything was wonderful. And I would be back there going, they're baiting you. I can't remember what her name was. They're baiting you. They're going to see what's the lowest thing that you'll take. And they were going pretty far. So. But you know, so they're pretty. They know when you're faking them.
yeah.
They know when you're faking, and they're pretty sensitive to. One year we had a poet who wanted the kids to stand up at the beginning of the poetry session each time. And these are the guys I think need to stand up and take a bow. And we had some wonderful poets that year. And it was always the same kids every week because they were wonderful. And the other kids hated it because they never got recognized and they could see that they were as good, and they were. But it wasn't as polished, but it was the gut feeling was there. So we're completely about play with language, trust it, have fun with it, love it. When you see the poets standing outside the door, stand up and scream. They're here, it's time, ready to go. Okay, and that's kind of what we're about. I figure, I'm with you guys, I figure we'll get to that editing stage. If they love it, then they can hear it later on. And if there's somebody says to me, okay, you need to take a poem and publish it, okay, we'll have the kids pick out their favorite, and we will do all that editing then, if we need to, once or twice, but mostly we don't.
Do you find, oh, sorry.
Can I have a list of those poets' names that were screaming wonderful and were being...
I will try to remember.
Sheryl Noethe, wasn't that the...
Sheryl Noethe was not Sheryl Noethe, and it wasn't Robert Lee either. It was somebody way back that lasted about a year.
I'll still find them.
And I think, and as a matter of fact, I think you came to visit us, and your eyes got big as saucers, and you went, what's this? Yeah.
Getting an idea
That only
now.
happened one time, but everybody else has been wonderful.
Do students ever struggle with, it sounds like, the creative writing time is fairly compartmentalized in that it's, we're not going to focus on spelling or any of these things. I mean, does that ever create any confusion when perhaps the next day there's a writing assignment in which those things count? Because it's not poetry, it's another kind of writing?
Not really, because I make it clear.
Yeah.
Okay, this time around, we always talk about your first draft and write it out and go ahead and get your ideas down and do the best you can for spelling, but we're going to go back and fix that. We have to fix that. And they don't have any trouble with that. It's fine. It's fine.
Carol is the ideal classroom teacher. I got to spend time with her last year with her students, and she obviously loves their work, and they wait for her to read. And even the shyest child will read because they know their teacher believes in it and will read as well. And she's gotten to be quite good, I have to say. I used to teach at the School for the Deaf. I used to work with language acquisition in deaf and hearing children. Deaf children learn grammar by a chart on the wall, and they memorize. You can imagine how successful that is. Deaf children loathe the English language. They have to do the charts and the memorization, and it's always wrong. However, with ASL, with their own sign language, their work is unique and beautiful because that's their language that they're comfortable with. That's where they're assured that they can say something that matters and that is right. So I'm the kind of person who learned most of my language conventions by reading because I was so freaked out in 4th and 5th and 6th grade about not doing right, not being right, not being popular, not having the clothes, none of those things. And so I didn't learn from my classroom because I was in the reptile zone of, is anybody going to kill me? Am I going to get in trouble? Am I wrong? Am I stupid? So I learned all of my conventions by reading and by context. And one way you can always tell someone who learned by reading is that they mispronounce things. Because I had never heard those words, but I'd read them. And so I've been very frequently corrected on my pronunciation because I learned by reading. Well, I got it because I needed it, not because the chart said the conjugation and those kind of things. I loved writing in spite of my teachers. And they told me I was maudlin. And I was proud to be maudlin. You know, when I get a child who writes, "The beautiful eagle soared across the beautiful mountains and the blue sky and the puffy clouds," I think, oh no, somebody stop me. Because, yeah, I want to hear the broken, disjointed, bizarre language that these children have inside of them that no one else has inside of them and hasn't yet been crushed out of them by wrong, wrong, wrong. Throughout school, you're always told, and throughout life, you're always told what you do wrong. And so the collaborative, we tell them what they do right. And so a child may not know what they're doing that's right and beautiful, but we find it and we tell them. And they then realize what they're doing right and they want to do it again and they want more success. We have a great success level with kids that are in trouble or on the edge or at risk or not doing well in math or in sports because they get a chance in poetry to tell their truth. And the language that they use is so unique. You know, poetry is a way of saying things that no one has ever said before. I don't want to hear about the beautiful eagle. I want to hear the stuff that they're not supposed to talk about. The stuff they're not supposed to say. Because if they don't say it, if they don't write it, it stays inside of them and it stifles their life and their creativity and their choices. T.S. Eliot, Walt Whitman, E.E. Cummings, everybody said that they ruined the English language. People were appalled. You know, they just upset the tea cart. They weren't, that's not right, you can't. And then they turn out to be the greatest poets, you know, of our society. And so they have to not mimic what they see on a chart or in the rules, but instead they have to trust that they can create and they can say it and that someone is listening and that it matters. I wonder how many hours children get spoken to at home and how many hours they're watching the computer screen or the TV. I think they're lonely. And a part of the Writing Collaborative is that social interaction where you get up and read something really sad or painful or difficult, and the other kids care about you for what you told them. Nobody laughs. It's a cruelty-free zone. And it makes them stronger and better people. The writer has to have a vast frame of reference and a great repertoire of honest responses. That was vivid, I say, when Mark's third graders write about the toilet every week. And I'm evaluating. Vivid. Lively.
So related.
But we don't discourage it.
You know,
Yes.
you talked about the deaf, working with the deaf kids.
Yeah.
Well, at Paxson
Yes.
Elementary, where I've been for a while, they've got a deaf ed program in the district there. And so I've had all these deaf kids and interpreters come into the room, which you've been involved in a couple times. But those people, those deaf kids will write in the way deaf kids talk.
Yes.
Which is like, let me.
Yes.
You know, it's like just different poetry that you're used to. And when they read it out loud, or when someone else reads it and they sign it, they are so proud of it, and the other kids respect it. You know, it's like that's one of the things our program does, I think, is it accepts everything and everyone. And that's why the kids love Poetry Day. They know the difference between the regular class schedule and what they're expected to do, and they know that they have total freedom in that poetry classroom, and they can do whatever they want to do, whatever they can get away with, because sometimes they don't get away with it and they get in trouble. I mean, from the school, we don't have any rules, but
No cruelty, no smart, mean remarks.
well, yeah, but there are sometimes other things that happen, and the teacher will put a
Yeah.
It happens.
Not very often, but.
No.
So any comments or thoughts from the audience? I want to open this up if we can. And maybe,
As a teacher, because you're they have to look at you different. Even though you encourage all of that, you're responsible to grade and to recorrect or redirect or whatever. It's really, even though you're with them all the time, it's really difficult to have that sense of trust. Like, I've gone through the writing process with my 6th graders for a really long time, and peer editing, it kills me. They don't want to say things bad about their peer stuff or correct their peer stuff or feel like they are hurting their peers' feelings. They'll hack my stuff apart. It makes me know that they understand what they're doing and have that sense of understanding. But peer editing, at least at the 6th grade level, is really difficult. And it's not, even though I encourage them that it's to improve and to see other areas, not that you were wrong before and this is better. Like, you can't, personally, I think failure's gotten to be a bad word, and you learn by making mistakes. So if you don't see their mistakes, you're not going to improve. So as a teacher, it was always great to have our poets come in because they had a completely different mindset, and to see what some of the kids would come up with. I don't know, I guess I was kind of jealous because it was hard. It's hard to get there in a classroom. That even though you want it to be free and open and work with each other, and you understand each other better than me trying to tell you what I thought it should say, peer editing was difficult. Even just getting that feedback.
yeah, thank you.
Lauren Byer, do you have anything to say? I was teaching her little brother, who was kind of a wild man. And he came in one day and he wrote a poem about his dirt bike, about jumping sandhills on his yellow dirt bike. And it was so fabulous, the other kids applauded. Well, I don't think he'd ever had applause in an English class before. But he told me, "You must meet my sister." And so I managed to get her into the classroom the next year, and the poetry that she wrote literally peeled the skin right back off my skull. It was so amazing. Her language was so original and unique and so powerful. And Lauren, I was wondering if you could just say a few things about how it affected you to have a poet work with you with your poetry, as opposed to just, an English teacher without that poetic influence.
Yeah, right. Well, first of all, thank you. And having a poet, so kind of starting at the beginning of the whole correction thing, I kind of think there's a place and time for both of it. I think at the middle school level, when I taught poetry, or was taught poetry from Sheryl, at Hellgate and in that setting, you had to basically seduce kids into liking poetry. It was hard going, and so if you were to kind of tell them to make changes and to do all this stuff, that it wouldn't really be received well. And then when I went into high school, this is my 4th year of ARI classes, and we do edits. And that is something that I appreciate in this level, because we are, as we take this class, we're obviously serious about creative writing. And so we're trying to make our work better, we're trying to make it publishable, we're trying to send it to other places and, get recognition. And so there is a time and a place, I think, for both of them, but having a poet in the middle school, especially in the most uncertain years of people's lives, is pretty influential. And I remember the first poem that I read out loud was probably the scariest moment of my life. It was awful.
And how did the kids respond?
Pretty well.
I'm sorry.
No.
You had an identity as a prize-winning poet. I mean, in the first week. Do you remember that? Everyone was always thrilled by your work and so impressed. And I love that verb you gave me, seduce, because it's true. And also your point about the corrections being at a certain time. I agree, absolutely. That maybe by high school when you're trying to get published in magazines, yeah, you want to know all of that. But when you're younger and you're starting out, being seduced by a poet, that all
Shame
help.
on you.
I'm curious what some of these students think about all this talk about relationships with their teachers and trust and not feeling at risk and all these things. I mean, does that language resonate with you guys? I mean, is that how it feels from your perspective too, that you're thinking, this is a safe environment and I can take risks and all these things?
I am the same as Lauren. I had Sheryl in middle school and I had Laura for 3 years in high school, and I think Laura Lee was one of my most influential teachers. I had the strongest bond with her than any of my other teachers, and I think a big part of that was because of the editing process, because we went through so many drafts and so much work for just one poem. We sat down together after school at lunch all the time to talk about this poem, and
Is she invasive?
Intrusive, I believe, was the word she used.
Finish your
Like-
thought.
But I am like Lauren. I think that the editing process has helped my work so much, and because I know I'm in a poetry class now at the university, and we just go through one draft. We just do a workshop. We go through one draft, and it's over. And I know I'm really happy with my draft, but I think about what I would have done back in Laura Lee's classroom and how that could have expanded. And I think a lot of times I would have felt like my first draft was really one-dimensional, but I didn't even realize that. I thought it was all of these things, and then Laura Lee would sit down with me and say, I think there are all of these underlying things going on that you should expand on, and that I couldn't really pinpoint myself, but she could find for me, or she could help me find. And I think that helped my writing immensely.
That's an interesting way of putting it, that the role of the teacher's response is to, if anything, sort of show the potential of the piece, which, the potential still belongs to the author, right? And sometimes you need another set of eyes to see that. I mean, I think any of us that have done any writing realize that we can lose a perspective of our own writing pretty quickly. Thank you.
Could I add off of that?
Please.
What she was saying. I think a lot of times what I've experienced through Laura Lee's classes is the relationship is enhanced through the editing process in a lot of situations. Because last year I started working on this short story, and it was a microfiction. It was 250 words, first draft, and that was in January. And June 1st, draft 21. The story was finally done, and it was like 12 pages long. And Laura Lee and I, it was a push for a while because I procrastinated. And so, for weeks we were on the phone every single night trying to get another draft done because we were trying to get this story published. And that helped. I mean, just talking to her all the time about this story, just constantly thinking about it. She was constantly thinking about it. We were doing 2 drafts a day so that we could meet deadline. And it was, I feel like I learned a lot about myself, but also just continued to develop relationships and trust. If my teacher has my cell phone number and you can call me at 10 o'clock at night because she's like, oh, by the way, your quote. So yeah, it was.
Just to be clear, we were on deadline and Ari wanted to publish that story, and it was You have to get it done now, or it's not gonna be able to go in. So
You collect all
I
their
do
cell
not
phone
do
numbers,
that
huh?
in October, I promise. I do not do that in
Lauren, can
October.
I ask you a question? I'm referencing back to the other remark. Do you think that had my remarks on your poems been more strongly editing, rewriting, spelling, etc., it would have helped or hindered?
I'm not sure. And I think I definitely needed you as a base. You know, I had no idea I liked writing until I took poetry from your classes. I wouldn't have joined creative writing in high school were it not for that. So it was a completely essential base. So I think it's really hard to say. I don't know.
Well, I think you said very well.
How about you, Kelton? Because you also had Sheryl?
Yeah.
And did Michelle or Amy, did you guys? Okay.
I would have to agree with Lauren. I think that there's definitely a difference in age when you can do that and when you can't, and or at least to the degree that you can do that. Because I think at that age, I also had no idea. I had no idea about writing or anything, and I liked the encouragement. I liked the one-on-one encouragement from you, and then I think then when I had Lauralee, then that's when it started expanding. So I would agree with Lauren.
You know, this is, I mean, I think everybody's on the same page
I
with
think
this
so.
whole idea.
Yeah.
And that's by the time you get to middle school or high school, then you really need to start creating those kinds of relationships, and they are so valuable throughout that time frame into your college years, into your young writing years, and then after you get to be an adult, then you take it upon yourself to seek out those ears that help you to keep things going and keep things moving. But with very, very young people, you know, we're talking about 3rd and 4th grade people, they just need the chance to let someone let them spit it out. You know, that's what's most important with those people. And so and as we move along and move up the scale, you start giving more and more feedback. 6th and 7th grade kids can appreciate and really learn from more and more, you know, slight invasive or intrusive suggestions or whatever. But at that very, very early age, they just need to feel all the things that he pointed out, those 5 things, and they need to be allowed to write what's in their heart and sing. That's what's most important. We all know this.
I've always felt that poetry is revolutionary, that poetry is a social instrument for change, but it's also revolutionary to the person who decides to spend the literary life. What do you think about that, Lauren and Mackenzie and other students from Kelton?
We're just gonna pick on you
I'm
guys.
sorry.
So, can you restate your question? Poetry being revolutionary?
Yeah, did you feel like, I mean, when I started writing poetry, my teacher told me I was going to be an author. It was a revolution. I changed who I was.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like a self-revolution. It's kind of
Yeah.
like a revolution, like, oh, I have things to say. And then when I was in middle school, I had a ton of things to say to so many people. So I think that it was definitely a self-revolution.
I don't know if I've reached that point in writing for myself yet. I know my poetry, I don't know if I'm saying a lot of things from within me, and most of my poetry is very like about nature, describing about nature and stuff. So I don't know if I've reached that point of self-revolution.
Do you ever stop yourself? Do you ever edit yourself and say, I can't use this language, this might upset my mother if she read it? Do you have an editor that censors you inside yourself?
Not in that sense, I don't think. I don't know. My writing is never really about like negative things that have happened to me or anything like that. And so, I mean, if I ever have some self-editing, it's usually like you're being too repetitive, you're being too much nature, you're doing the same thing over again, maybe you should try to do something more dark or more something.
Well, Lauren, I consider something,
Try something dark out for a
darker.
change.
Try
something modeling.
More modeling. Well, Lauren, I thought your work was quite revolutionary, the things that you addressed. You know what I'm talking about?
No. Like,
About, like, your family, about the things, when we wrote about truth and lies, and the truth that you wrote, was that hard?
yeah.
Because sometimes you didn't want me to read your poems out loud or publish them, remember?
I know. I do remember that.
Has that changed?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, because I do remember the first poem I read out loud, like I was saying in front of that class, like, it was super scary.
Yeah.
And now I think I love poetry, because I think they're fun. So that's changed a lot for me, and I'm really glad that's changed.
Yeah.
Sheryl and Amy, do you guys want to say anything? Is there anything you want to add?
I feel the same as Kelton. Like, my poetry is very simple and just, I don't write about things that people would say, oh, I don't like that, or that's like, I don't know, too out there, I suppose. So,
You write about observations, or?
like what I see, pretty much.
How about you, Mom? The fellow. Fellow. How about you? Did you have a poet in your classroom ever, or when did you come to poetry?
I'm not much of a poet.
Are you prose?
What?
Prose? Stories?
Kind of. I like writing sometimes. I'm not in any creative writing class.
Uh-huh.
And in elementary school, there was never a poetry teacher who would come in.
Uh-huh.
But I enjoy doing it sometimes.
So you're pretty much self-motivated as far as your writing?
Yeah.
And that lovely girl next to you, would you tell us something about your perspective?
Well, for me, I was never introduced into writing at all until pretty much high school. And in fact, I remember you came to our English class, and I remember you reading my poem because I was too scared to read it, and you complimented it, and I really felt happy about that. I probably would have not have entered eventually Laurel's creative writing class and then this year her Airy class if you had not done that, because I was very unsure of myself at that time. And I'm still working on that, but I feel like writing my own words and then eventually saying them out loud helped a lot more.
Now, what classroom was that?
It's numbers English.
At Big Sky?
Big Sky.
Okay,
4 years ago.
thank you.
Well, and I talked to my students a little bit at the beginning of the year about money, and a little bit worried about whether or not we were going to be able to have the collaborative teachers. And you should have seen their faces. It was, it was unbelievable. I mean, do you want them to come? Should I fight for you for this? And it was, yeah. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was just resounding. We want them. I mean, it's important.
We went through a year last year when we didn't have any money to
Yeah.
have anybody come.
Yeah.
And we just said, well, the money's not there, we can't do it this year. The parents went to bat for us and said, okay, we need to have this here, and funded it. And then I understand we got some funding from the superintendent, a little bit. And then, but then this year, yes. And then this year, the collaborative's gonna be in every 4th grade
That's
class in Missoula County Public Schools, and we are so excited about that. But we so missed that. We so missed that. And it was such a wonderful thing. And the kids were going, are we gonna do poetry this year? Because the kids I had last year, have had a little bit of Robert the year before. Are they gonna do it again? Are we gonna do it again? Well, we don't have any money for it. And it's very, very frustrating.
And then Dr. Apostle wrote us a check so that we could spend some time. And I got to come into your room.
We did. And it was fun. We had fun with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're excited to see you guys back.
Yes.
Any other comments?
Well, I have one.
Yeah.
When I was in ninth grade, there was a program called Urban Arts. And we got to take a city bus from school and go to this old mansion with poets and write with them. And it was so exciting and wonderful and free and open that we could be with each other and poets and write and read, and nothing was forbidden. Everything was possible. And it was the best experience of my education. And most kids don't get that. Maybe they get an art teacher once a month, Mrs. Potts. Yeah, one art teacher once a month. And so the parents are going to bat. And the PTA, through the yeah. And that chance that I got redirected my life because it opened up a world. Because I didn't fit anywhere else, and it gave me a place.
That sounds like a...
Oh, I was just going to reiterate exactly what she said, in that, I never thought about reading until I got into high school, and I sure never thought about writing until we had a visit from a poet in the schools from the Montana Arts Council when I was in high school, the first year of the program.
Who was that?
Who was the poet?
Yeah.
James Welch.
Oh, God. Wow.
And, James Welch grew up on the High Line and lived between Harlem and Browning. And when he came down here to go to school, I guess, from what Ed and Lois and other people have said, he first started trying to write poetry, like Keats or something. And, of course, everybody was like, And they kept telling him, man, you need to write about that country you came from, the High Line. You need to write about Harlem. You need to write about Browning. And so he started writing poems like that. And that's what he shared. He had not published the book that came out of that was called Writing the Earth Boy 40, a collection of poems. He had not published it yet. It was just in manuscript form, but he had all these poems. My First Hard Springtime, Harlem, Just Off the Reservation, all these great poems that he shared with us in this workshop. And he said, you guys need to write about where you come from. You need to write about Alberton, Montana. You need to write about railroad trains and fishing up the creek, or whatever you do, where you come from. You need to observe, write about what you see. And what happens in those observations is you come out. It's like you can't help it. Every poem is a self-portrait. You're in there, whether you're just looking at the weeds or not, right? I mean, that's what you discover in a poem. And so anyway, he said, you need to write, and I've just been, that's how I've entertained myself ever since. Is writing these little things, to myself. No one wanted to read for at least 20-some years. But
And what's the title of your last book? Weeds?
Well,
no,
Mark,
but anyway.
And that brings me back to what the second half of my story, because I forgot it looking at everyone. But I wrote poetry to get into this program, and I wrote this rhyming poem about, and I stopped to pray and the angels, and I took it in, and the man that was teaching the class said, Grandpa could have written this. And he said, you got to break it open. You got to break it wide open. And it changed everything, breaking it open. We have to go?
And that's what we do.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.